Anyway, welcome to here. It seemed that we better start now if there's going to be some time for questions. So welcome all, and very happy to have provided you with breakfast. For those who attended one of yesterday morning's sessions, very pleased that we've provided you with breakfast. This is you get asked back in July to try and say, what are you going to talk about? Well, next January, what are you going to talk about? So inevitably, we try and think of a sort of title that will try and cover things. But really, we are looking, the slides that are coming are looking at how farming needs to recognise where we are now and how it might move forward and the kind of issues in all of that. And the openness to change, the assumption of much greater responsibility with government effectively having evacuated the field at this point is perhaps where we are. For those who, are just wondering who is standing on the platform, I'm Jeremy Moody. I'm Secretary and Advisor to the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers. If you move on, yes, we'll move on a slide. UK-wide specialist professional association, briefing, qualifying, representing agricultural valuers across the whole UK, all four jurisdictions, and been doing it for well over a century. And the object of what we are looking to do is try and provide rounded advice so that it's client-focused, very specific to the circumstances in hand, and then trying to help people. And these are the times when this is just most important to try and take stock. And a theme, instead of running through these slides, is around the need to look at things in plain sight. There's plenty that's there, there's plenty that's been there, but it doesn't necessarily fit with the ways that people have looked at the world over the last 30 years or more. And I'm going to suggest that if you do look at the world through that prism of the past, you're likely not to understand quite what's going on. And I think that's a very significant point to look at while we come to this. So really that is, if you like, the theme of this slide, which is to smell the coffee, and coffee is provided, and indeed we've stolen more from next door, just to make sure you can smell it. But it is actually that sense of achieving a sense of reality as to where we are. A little later in these slides is a reference, I think, to us being in a third post-war age. We had, if you like, the whole period of the Cold War and so on up to the Berlin Wall, relatively stable, but quite a lot of tension. We've had the non-inflationary constant expansion years as China joined the world labour market and inflation was low, and we lived with the glow after the Berlin Wall. And somewhere around about 2008, we've hit a new age whose character is becoming clearer, but it is one of risk, it's one of uncertainty, it's one of volatility, and the same point as which we're meeting now, the unfolding of much more extreme weathers as we come through this. Very clearly the security interests are being quite blunt right the way across Western Europe. We should recognise that we're in a pre-war era at the moment, and contemplating some of the headlines today about public finance, looking at where we might be, and of course in terms of really meaning spending for defence. You go back 1933, we got worried by Japan, we took defence spending, and from 1933, from 2.3% of GDP, roughly where we are now, by 38 we got to 6.9% of GDP, never minding the 40-odd% we reached in the Second War. Now you start thinking about the shocks of that going through all the other distributions of public spending, particularly with where the economy is. There's a lot here to try and take on board, and it's only when we break out of a sense of comfort and entitlement that we begin actually to see quite what we might have to face, and food supply fits into that as we run on. So 3 slides quickly, should be, there we are, around this one. The larger food chain, because actually as we saw with COVID, getting food to people is much more than simply producing it on British farms. And there's the whole background of the stuff up chain, and at this point looking at environment, weather, water, and so on coming through. We'll come to the business of production in a moment. But downstream, the public is relying on an enormously complex, sophisticated food supply chain. A lot of processing, more and more eating out of house or pre-processed meals coming through. Fundamentally, though, picking up on a really key issue, which may become quite important, how we have now made ourselves so little resilient by relying purely and solely on a national supply of electricity, a nationally transmitted and distributed supply of electricity. It could easily be that a war doesn't look like a war that we've known if you simply take out several power stations and half the grid. You've probably got social collapse within 12 hours. There's supposed to be 8 hours of milk within the M25. the issues around this, but we're now in a society that will grind to a halt. There was the entertaining picture of, I think it was when there was massive flooding in Lancaster, and the teenagers all turned up in A&E. That's where they could get their phones charged. And looking at the risks that come through on this, I think are really quite dependent. And it's now that IT is the systems we all use, wonderful until it isn't. And that, again, is fundamentally electricity dependent, and indeed it's increased. We're now watching electricity demand now start rising. That's beginning to come through in the figures as we look at all of this. And of course, preparedness planning, it's like insurance. You only know whether you're covered when the crisis happens. And we thought that all the good scientific studies, if you had read them in February 2000, would have said that we, along with the US, were the best prepared countries for a pandemic. We thought we'd prepared, we'd worked for it, and so on, and then actually the pandemic that came wasn't the one we'd prepared for. And so it's thinking about the variety of risk that's out there, the sensitivities. These are the issues around resilience and so on as we go through. So looking then, hoping we have, yes, we managed to move on. The risks to food supply in this, and I think this is the importance of maintaining a critical mass and a capacity to produce in this country that's really important. And it's, the question then is, what are we trying to produce and who for? And the world I've just presented you with gives you, if you like, two views you have probably to hold at the same time, which is that you're producing in peacetime for peacetime circumstances, but do you have the capacity to do an entirely different set of production when it comes to providing in an extreme crisis? The kind of production that we would do to give a bare ration to the British public would be different to the kind of production we do to make the most profit. And I think there's some very interesting tensions in terms of thinking ahead about planning. We are disrupted, obviously, behind that, as we said, by climate change and ecosystems and so on. But just think about virtually everything that goes into the system. You know, one of the issues with the border trade operating model has been how you get certain quantities of seeds into the country. Fertilizers, well, we're no longer producing now the raw materials for fertilizer. Phosphates come from abroad. We'll talk about labor a bit later on, the issues over chemistry. You look at these supplies, these are structural issues to think about as we go on towards later slides. But it's capacity, the skills, the actual people to manage, even if we innovate very heavily, and the fixed equipment in the land. Everything from under drainage right the way through proper storage and the rest. And just the interesting, you'll see shadows of this as we go through this. It's always interesting to look back at the last time we really faced this. And quite a lot of what we think we tell ourselves, what we do tell ourselves about World War II, is to an extent mistaken. We did not solely feed the country from within the UK. We relied massively on imports, but we managed them from across the empire. So what we did was we produced the low-value, high-bulk goods here and imported the high nutrient value from New Zealand, from Australia, from Canada. And here, at the point where the world felt it had a food glut in 1940, before we then discovered shortage, we quietly went off, snuck over the Atlantic and bought up the entire Canadian wheat crop in 1940, so that we had that reserve against what was coming. Very largely all this about the efficient use of shipping in all of this. And the question is, does the Navy now really command the North Atlantic sea lanes? So just thinking through some of these things as we play with this. And then who is to be fed? And thinking about Jack Bobo yesterday, he's got that chart. You go to 2050, we've got an expanding population probably here, particularly with migration. And then what happens thereafter, we wait to see. That entirely in the hands of migration, whatever happens at a global level. But we're feeding an aging population almost certainly within that. And probably people who are eating a little less, all the social trends about less confidence in fresh food ingredients coming around this. And so less confident in that. And of course the rise that we see, and no real reason for it to stop, of that catering and processing sector. So if people get very interested in what actually goes on their table, less interested often in the provenance of what comes pre-prepared or they eat outside. And so thinking through some of those challenges as we play with this. But equally, the third table, the third plate in this, after eating at home, eating out, is what we export. And those are, and I think there's a theme, and it comes through from Minette Batters, is looking at where we can make profit by comparative advantage probably moving our way with climate change in terms of how we can make money exporting, and by doing that, creating alternative markets into which our current buyers have then to bid. And introducing that competitive pressure may well be quite an important force if we can do this. And then, of course, a critical thing for commodity production in this country is, can we keep the processing capacity? If you look at, for example, that entire complex of vegetable processing within 50 miles of the Wash, that helps keep all that there, that becomes not necessarily as integrated as British sugar and sugar production, but it's all a system. And if you've got the factories there, they value the production locally, it all works. If you lose the processing capacity, you might as well be in Ghana at that point. So looking again at some of these things as we go through. And I think one of the morals from people who look, particularly a lot of this is in the shadow of discussing economic growth across the whole economy and the problems we face there. The studies of those economies that really have grown over the last couple of generations is the fundamental point: they need to want to grow. They need to want to accept the change that's necessary for them to do it and not stay where they are. And I think that's a powerful issue for us as a country, and a powerful issue then looking for us as a sector. You can be very comfortable. The frog can be boiled very slowly and very gently. You can just decline as you go, and it's easy. You don't notice it year on year. To break out, and the theme going back to that smell the coffee slide, is the sheer amount of accumulated change that is now unfolding, at quite some pace as we come through. And I think that's what we then have to react to and try and respond to. And so having held it back, and really for a lot of farming, we held it back with 30 years of area payments. The McSharry payments were basically area payments, single payment, then basic payment. They rewarded people for occupying land, so you stayed occupying land. It muffled the change that would otherwise have happened. And in England, where it's now effectively gone, then the dam breaks. And then we watch that unfold over the next handful of years. And the simple point is, there is no magic answer in this. Those who are simply looking for an easy, convenient answer, a swift way to find money at the end of the rainbow without pain, without changing, to have the income that gives the lifestyle they want, it's not there. There'll be different answers for different people in all of this as they work through with their skills and motives and risks and opportunities and resources and all the rest of this. Individuals will find answers. No, the point's made, there will be people who can manage to generate a good income out of local markets or out of B&G or whatever it might be, but these are not comprehensive answers. The comprehensive answers lie in having better businesses. And the core of that for farming businesses is farming. The business of farming is farming as a business. So yes, this comes back then, so just to lift it from Shakespeare's great strategic play of Julius Caesar, the end of Republican Rome. And he basically puts it twice, puts it in two different ways. You can either simply say, well, it's fate, live with it, we're not masters, or you can say you seize the tide as in here, and make your future. And those are the choices, and the people who manage what they can control and get on with doing it are the people who will make something of this. The people who are hanging around waiting to receive change will have change happen to them and master it less well. So I think it is looking at this and thinking ahead, and this sort of clear-sightedness I'm trying to recommend. We've done that, there we are. Sorry, yes, just give you a chance to look at the quotes while they're there. Because they make the point. And then, of course, just to deal with this, while people are completely reasonably pleased with the reward before Christmas of the increase in the full relief band for inheritance tax, and the extent, and noting the extent to which the near loss of full relief from inheritance tax was a massive stimulus for people to sit down and think about their businesses and their families and their future and succession. Inheritance tax has not gone away. This has tempered the wind to the shorn lamb. It has eased the pressure. It has removed it for quite a lot of the smaller players or those with assets better distributed around the family. But for many medium businesses and larger businesses and more complex businesses, that is a cash call on the business at some point. The need to reflect on how you manage it, how you prepare for it, how you might avoid it, how you deal with devolving assets, how you look at management and structure. And from our end, also the valuation issues that all go with actually having to deal with it. All those remain part of the framework in all of this as an added risk. The idea that you enable better, more resilient businesses by forcibly taking capital out of them remains bizarre. But it's still there for something, and here we have got multiple needs. So there are arguments that farming is over-capitalised, over-invested as a sector, but we have got investment in change that we have to do. So it's the reinvestment of the things that we need to replace. It's the investment now in looking at new technologies. It's the investment in fixed assets to give resilience against climate change. It's all the investment in the new enterprises. Even if older investment becomes obsolete faster, all this still comes through. So yes, I think perhaps the starkest way to put this is to see October the 30th, see a 70-minute speech on October the 30th, 2024, as a pivot point on which the fulcrum of change then acted, that things turned on a sixpence. We had full inheritance tax relief for APR and BPR effectively from April 1992. We had area payments from call it calendar 93. We were phasing out basic payments in England. We got sort of halfway. Effectively, the effect of the budget speech followed by the spending review is that area payments were substantively removed. What you're getting in the de-linked payment this year might as well be, for most people, the pensioners' winter fuel allowance. And so what was on a phased, gradual transition was removed overnight, became a cliff edge. And similarly, the tax assumptions for the capital base of farming were changed for all practical purposes on a sixpence after 30 years. And seeing that as a pivot point. And there were statements made in the Budget Red Book, there were statements made by the DEFRA blog on that day, which said, don't look to us for direct support. We don't know that even we can fund schemes for doing the public goods. They said we don't even know that we can fund flood defence. And the figures that Emma Reynolds was giving yesterday look big because they're spread over a longer period than was ever said before. In real world terms, we are now to spend only 2/3 on flood defence of what we were spending in 2021. You're watching that withdrawal of support in flood defence. You would have thought, whatever they may or may not think about farming, having people watching the water rising past their knees is decidedly uncomfortable. So we're watching this, and it's looking at that as the months have gone by, that the starkness of that 70-minute budget speech of Rachel Reeves' first budget seems to me to become ever more clear as you look at it. And that's the moment of plain sight. And that's why I'm saying that even though we've had the amelioration of inheritance tax, all those come together with all the external pressures for change as the prompt to consider an action. And as we said, it's individual answers for everybody. Each will be under different pressures, different situations, different land tenure structures, and all of that as we come through. But we've got this sense, and go back to a phrase I've been using but probably since the referendum, which is, however you dice it, you can use the phrase as a generation's worth of change in a decade. Whether you want to see it's the loss of area payments for a generation, the run through to 2050, wherever we actually get to on net zero, but all the other changes that are going on as the world changes quite radically around us, and looking at all of that. And just the theme here, if I were doing this last summer, when I've been asked to provide a title for all of this, I'd have said we know less about agricultural policy than we did a year ago. And there's that sense that I think, and again for another presentation, that what we have seen with, from the days, you hear the word stability yesterday, repeated ceaselessly. A year ago, we weren't going to upset the apple cart. Or actually 16 months ago, we weren't going to upset the apple cart. And then you had almost, it's like a clockwork machine just being left to run down. The capital grants runs down, no answers. Where's my application gone last autumn? A little bit later, it was just paused. We have the abrupt cessation of SFI applications. We have the tardy decision-making on countryside stewardship coming through later on. It's just a clockwork that's run down. I think a question just to pose on the table and fit the theme here is actually, do we usefully have an agricultural policy at all? Now, we may be seeing the bones of one being created. That may be where Batters goes. the chicken from the egg of the inheritance tax arguments. Where Lord knows what a roadmap does. We can look at that. It's possible. Now, we may be at that point where things change. But at the moment, and for the purposes of this presentation, I leave that question as to whether we actually have an agricultural policy that's worth the name you would want to describe as such as we go through it. So we've got all these messages coming through, but much distraction on many fronts. The core of answering it lies in your business. Manage what you can control, not think about necessarily the larger realms of all of this. And in that, of course, and here very much to stress from this platform, the role of good professional advice in all of this, appropriate, relevant professional advice. Your valuer, yes, your lawyer, your accountant, but taking this into fact so that you don't make unforced mistakes, so that you have safe challengers, so that you have trusted advisors. All of this is about making better decisions as you go through. And as I keep saying, there is no single answer in all of this. But the simple point, and it came home very clearly to me, talking on a platform with a senior representative of another body in June. And there's been a line for a long time about the need to explain why you get the subsidies and all of this. And it just tripped off said person's tongue, and there's no necessary problem in that. But it looked then, again, the moment in plain sight, just after the spending review. If you get no payments, you've got nothing to justify. You are not beholden to anybody. You are in command of your business, making your business decisions for which you take responsibility, and you look at the world in that light. You aren't having to conform to government schemes unless you choose to go into whatever the scheme is that's in mind as and when it happens. And I think this is an absolutely critical point as the months since October 24 make the new world look clear. It is this one in which you're looking at running. This is now you running a business. Yes, government can get in the way, and yes, government can be helpful, and yes, government could help with planning and the other things we ask for in a moment we'll look at. But actually, it's the decisions about what you can control that really drive this, and thinking about it, and try and go back to my earlier point, trying to think about this through the prism of the years from, let's say, 92 to 2024 is missing the point. So very much I think, and that is, for many, a massive shift of thinking. It's a massive psychological change in where they look. There was a discussion in yesterday afternoon's DEFRA presentation in the room round the corner, in which studies in the uplands were talking about people's resentment of a parent-child relationship with DEFRA. I think it really meant the RPA enforcing EU rules. But in that sense, but if you aren't in those schemes, there aren't those there to enforce. And that is a big shift which those who are looking at the world can prepare themselves to make, and the new analyses that flow from that, rather than continuing, I think, on a false assumption. That is phenomenally difficult for some people who've been bred in the bone on that score. It's massively opportunities for people who step back and look. So it reshapes thinking. The major shift of outlook in all of that, looking to be proactive businesses, and it's the shift of mindset, if you like, from support to action. It's perhaps a way of trying to put it best. So schemes, as and when something emerges out of the new slimmed down SFI, small people queue first, is that it's a business choice. It's not the trope that some people had, oh, I'm doing all this because I'm going to get my basic payment back. No, it was always only ever to buy change that might cost you. So think it through. Is this rational for my business to do it? Does it add me margin? Does it pay me to do something I need to do anyway? Like, if there are likely to be good soils measures in it. We'll see later on. Good soils are fundamentally important. If that pays you to do something that you'll need to do anyway, take the money. If it distorts your rotation, fundamentally compromises your business, then don't do it. And it's looking at it not as something you feel you should do. These are options, they're not salvation, as you come through to look at all of this. And ultimately, the critical factor in this is all the studies fundamentally show that the principal difference, the overwhelmingly principal difference between high-performing businesses and others is management. Anderson's study, done for this conference back in 2018, actually ascribed 95% of the difference to management over, and this is on commodity businesses, looking at control, particularly over fixed costs, but also variable. Variable costs are looking more important at the moment. But Minette Batter's reports, she, looking across different sectors, different figures, very crude summary, 2/3 of the difference in performance lies in management. If you had any problem for which one issue was 2/3 of the answer, in today's world, you'd seize on that with glee. It's management, and a lot of that is cost control. Only 45% of high-performing businesses, says Minette, have formal plans. There is so much more that people can be doing in looking at all of this. But it's that role of the farmer taking agency, taking action, reviewing a business, delivering and there's always continual management improvement, but the world is always throwing new challenges at you. But it's much more demanding doing farm management now than it was. You're facing that wider range of weathers and the other issues and volatile markets. So this is not, the easy bit is standing on a platform talking about it. The harder thing is out there in the business. So some themes in that: expect volatility. Reflecting on the last 6 years, was 21, I'm trying to remember 21 really, but was 21 the last sort of normal average year? 20 was hot, 22 was hotter, 23 and 24 were vile, wet and sodden. 25, well, if you're in southern and eastern England, it was 2 quarters of extreme heat and drought. If you're elsewhere, you got 1 quarter of drought. But it's the volatility in all of this having to respond to. Looking for better soils, we've already stressed. That's the biome, it's organic matter, and all this trying to, and there's a phrase I borrowed for these slides a little later on, around seeing soils and soil biome as an immune system for the farm, partly with the biological side, but also with the water management coming through on this. Issues around, if you're going to be resilient, then do you look at broadening and other things in the rotation to handle risks in all of this? The use of data, that's going to be fundamental to how we use the new technologies. But it's not just collecting it. It's great, most people can pop it in a file. Do you actually look at it? Do you analyze it? What data is relevant? How do you know what's relevant? And working through some of those things as they come through, we are going to be driven to innovate if we are going to deal with this. As people, we're effectively driven by the market from horses to tractors, but labour, we'll see later on, is an issue that will tend to drive us towards innovation. And the response to faster change. None of this is a step change. You're going onto an escalator, not just a step. You're going into a restless sea and managing that. And the alternative response to all of this, which is to hunker down, take the pain, find the extra notch in the belt you never knew you had, that's just going backwards. And if these are the moments of choice, Minette was saying yesterday morning, basically her view was, partly because she's just written the report and is desperately anxious to get it through, but it makes a point. They're 2 critical years now. If we miss the moment now, the prompt from IHT, the prompt from the loss of area payments, the stimulus given by Minette's report, all the rest of this, then when will we get our act together? I think there's a fair point in that from Minette. And then when as we come around to look at policy, there is this wonderful idea that's around the modern world doesn't like trade-offs. Modern world doesn't like hard choices. So of course every policy has to deliver something for everything. So I'm sceptical about the view that that there is a serious link in terms of economic and business action between public health and farm production. Just because, and I had this run-in with Tim Benson, is just because we think the British public should eat more fruit and veg, that doesn't create the economics for more fruit and veg to be grown here. What does? Work it through and begin to think as to where that goes. Let's have in economics, there's a rule called Tinbergen's law, basically says 1 goal, 1 tool. That gets you much more efficient answers and delivery rather than compromising and in the end falling between all available stools on all of this, so that we don't wind up with policies that feel terribly good when you say them, but are ineffective in action and basically fail. And the longer you leave it, all these choices just get harder. So, 2 productivity reports. With Minette as a stimulus, we produced our productivity manifesto. Copies are available on the website, or you can contact me. That was written as of last July. I mean, obviously thinking does evolve, but it sits there as a view of the issues of what's important here. And then we have Minette's report, delivered at the end of October, published on the last possible parliamentary day before Christmas. And so you have that. Somewhere on here, who are here with our thoughts about profitability, looking at this. A lot of it is about actually the shift of government language and industry language to favour, support, endorse, celebrate success. So we actually look to celebrate the people who are good. We look to see them as a good thing, and so on in this, but much more openness to flexibility, and then the focus on financial margin, open markets, more flexible markets in land occupation and use, so that the people who are finding all this terribly difficult can still own their land, but make it available to people who farm it well, giving them a good income, better perhaps than they were making before, and we move forward. The fundamental importance of science, research, innovation, and adoption coming through, planning, more permitted development rights, all that was being said yesterday with the NPPF is simply about words to local councils about how they might give permission. We haven't crossed the threshold yet for the permitted development rights that Steve Reed talked about a year ago at this conference. Capital allowances. Farming depends, like manufacturing, depends so much on its fixed equipment. Capital allowances, rather than grants as a regime to allow people to do what they want when it's suitable for them to do it, and have the kind of immediate or early write-off, rather than structures and buildings allowance over 33 years. An export drive for alternative markets. And you'll see themes like this overlap with where we are with Minette as we go through. She talks much more about the machinery of government and trying to get DEFRA to look much more like an economic department. We have, so she wants, again, DEFRA market monitoring to be more coherent and available. Again, she'll talk about exports. She'll analyse this again at the next level, looking at sectors, which is important. She's got her soil programme as something that's a baseline for both public and private schemes. Skills and data support is there, and then regulation, planning, tactics. Lots of overlap in all of this as we go through. But the point I'm stressing here is the farmer role in all of this. Government can do whatever it likes. Government can possibly even be helpful. But it's the business of taking the horse to the water. The positive actions to take advantage of all of that are the other half, the other hand in the handshake that actually matter as we come through this. And so we wait really for the serious, as we heard yesterday, the serious government answer to Minette, probably coming with a farming roadmap, they suggest, but we wait to see. And here we are, this is the basic point. It's for farmers to act in all of this. The ball is in our court, looking at all of this. And manage, again, the theme, manage what you can control as we go through. And in this, just thinking, though, about the processes of change. There's rather too much, if you like, a static focus. We remove a certain payment, therefore everybody's poorer. No, because everybody then reacts, they adapt, they change. There are dynamic changes in businesses that flow through. It's like ripples on a pond. One thing happens, another thing happens. Values shift, people make new choices. And they see that, and as I'm trying to suggest today, they see the world in new ways. And it's this side, I think it's arguably a fundamental weakness in how this government understands the economy, is they don't understand how people react to things that they do, and how it bears on this. But this is the real world of a market economy, as that restless sea then rebalances things. And we watch all those things coming through as people then look now at new ways to do costs, they look at new operations, they look at new ways to structure things, and so on, and it all goes through, and they find new markets and new profit. But of course, in the politics of all of this, you always hear most loudly from those who feel that they're most hurt by it. It's a natural human reaction. The people who are making the future are working damned hard getting on with it. And I was talking up at the Northern Farming Conference, and somebody along these themes, and somebody came up afterwards and said, I think I'm one of the people you're talking about. And basically over 30 years, he's gone from, in simple terms, from having a couple of £1,000 to being the owner-occupier farmer without debt of 500 acres as a beef and sheep farmer. And there is somebody who has just got on and done what was sensible in his light. And doubtless, there's always luck in it, but we make our luck. There are people who are out there. So, moving on, yes, where are we? Well, it's all a bit desperate, really. But the important thing about productivity is, there we are. A lot of confusion around words, and frankly, at this level of discussion, there's not a lot of point in distinguishing between productivity, profitability, and competitiveness. They're all good things. And they're all basically, in the end, about responding to the market, about being efficient in what outputs you get from what inputs, and making out of all of this. But fundamentally, improving productivity is what puts a better breakfast on the table tomorrow. It's what keeps you up with the neighbours. It's what enables thriving businesses that can reinvest. And so we have the problem that fundamentally since 1964, taking the really long view, we haven't actually done terribly well on this. We did better, and what we're doing, we're actually getting worse each decade that goes past. And here, the simple contrast, we've been running at under 0.9% a year, incidentally so for discussion about Ireland, so is the Irish Republic. The Dutch are a bit of a stellar example at this point, but you can play it through with the US or other places, running at much higher levels of annual growth. Any glimmer of compound interest shows you this massive difference between those two figures as it goes through. And the issues are about skills and management and innovation. And the high performance farmers, of course, are always doing this better. So there they've got the story as you run through. Here we were actually, as we thought, all that chest beating we did back in the early 70s saying that we're all so much more efficient than European farmers. We were growing faster than them, except for the Dutch. Then we joined the pack. And since the early 90s, we've been falling behind the pack. And that's really what that chart shows. We're the sludge-coloured line on the pack, if you can just about see that. But that's a long distance story. And within that, of course, the enormous range of performances. This is a more detailed table, really since 1990. And basically, it's a deteriorating position. And what we've actually done, where we got improvement, it's essentially because we've used inputs more efficiently, not because we've increased output. So if we're coming back to feeding the nation, we're doing same for less, not more for less. And then if we actually look at where we are, what we've really scored, and it's a very easy way to look at productivity, what we've really scored is labour productivity. I think there's an open question of how much labour there is left to get out at that point. But you look at the other factors of production, and really it's sort of bobbled along. And taking big broadacre use combinable crops. I mean, during the 80s, I saw wheat go from 2 tonne an acre to the cutting edge 4 tonne an acre. We've consolidated the 4 tonne an acre figure very much, but we haven't actually, we've had yields flat line really since certainly the start of the millennium, if not actually a bit longer. And of course, at the same point, we have now watched prices erode. Crudely, today's wheat price would be £120 10 years ago. And so thinking through as to how we deal with this, those are the drivers of change. And in that, it's been conventional and I think right classically to look at the enormous differences between farmers on fixed costs. Actually, variable costs here are coming back into the frame. And these are figures from series, just looking at all of this. Yes, the countries whose fixed costs are half ours, that was reasonably predictable, but actually that we are significantly more expensive than some West European countries is quite interesting. And things just perhaps to think about and understand a bit more, but again, it comes back to management and all of this. And this is a chart, I think I probably used it last year, but essentially for a string of mainstream arable crops, combinable crops, it shows that the good of producing a net margin, and the rest is, the blue is the indifferent middle. And I think that puts something that is often not readily talked about a little too stark. It requires change then to achieve improved productivity, and we then have to look at all the ways of doing it. There'll be a better slide on this, I think, in a moment. Yes, the ways of change. And really the classic answers in the rest of the economy are about skills, innovation, and investment. Farming, I think, has an extra factor, and it's people. Land is a factor of production. How do we act, not more than its premises? How do we actually get land in so that it's used and farmed best by the most proficient people? And that is the extra one, the application of skill to land, just as in the rest of the industry, it's the application of skill to capital and to innovation and to labour. There's this extra factor here. And by and large, if you want a broad assumption, get the right who involved, and they'll sort the rest. Get the wrong who involved, and they'll make a pig's ear of the rest. And so it is the critical role, the ghost in the machine, is the quality of management, the quality of the people doing the farming. And we have them, but giving them more their head, giving them more opportunities, I see as quite critical in all of this. And then a lot of the productivity analysis then looks at business dynamism, and fundamentally the positive way of looking at this is business creation, but it's also about reallocation of assets between businesses and all of this. And the question is, do we have the business dynamism that we need? And there are open questions here. The average life, for what it's worth, and all agricultural statistics dissolve in front of your eyes when you look at them. They're all unreliable. Nobody knows what is a farm to define it before to get anything out of the data and all the rest of it. They point to an average life of somewhere around, pick a figure, 33 years. Is that good? Is that bad? You don't want too much churn because there's pointless reallocation of assets, cost, loss of experience, and the rest. But you can have too much stability. And in a sense, to throw this one out, if running into the 2028 Olympics, we narrowed our choices to the people who were the children of the 2020 Olympics team, would we do as well? And I think that it's that openness to outside views, outside talent, new genes, all the rest of it in that particular analysis. So the business dynamism one there. And yeah, we're moving on. So produce more from less, that's where we are. And you know, sitting in the agricultural productivity group with DEFRA, and then we've adopted this in that productivity manifesto, took a view, okay, and Minette picks up the argument about we're 0.56 of GDP. Well, actually, I would have thought in the current state of economic growth, nobody should rubbish any sector that's worth 0.56 of GDP. We could do with 0.56 of GDP, but actually, why not? Simply say our goal, and then we can look at it by sectors and the rest, our goal is 1% of GDP. Turn it round, drive, have aspiration. Comes back to the language of celebration in all of this. But like so much about words today, we need to mean it and go take the change that goes with that. And then that begins to say, well, okay, maybe there is a need for farming visions, and we can begin perhaps to play with that. So today's UK, well, we've got more than half as many people again as we had in 1940, just using that comparison. Self-supply then automatically becomes more challenging because we have more people. And for nearly 20 years, we've had a completely stagnant economy. Effectively, it has been the Greek crisis of 15 years ago in slow motion. Over 17 years, we are now 32% poorer than we would have been had we grown the way we were growing before. And if you start turning the charts around, it really makes it look like it's in slow motion, so the frog has been boiled slowly. We haven't noticed. We just get more uncomfortable. But others have grown, of course, not in Northwest Europe. But in Eastern Europe, in Far East, in the States, you're looking at economic growth continuing. We fall behind. For the argument that we, as a rich country, can buy our way out of food supply, in 2008, our GDP per head was 6 times the global average. Last figure I saw, we're now 3.75 times the global average. Competition for other people's food becomes more demanding on those figures. So some strands around here on farming policy, and these are just arguments. And I've gone back to, again, the World War II arguments. These were the 4 camps that were in play as they looked at, well, how do we get through the war, and then what do we do beyond it in a world where food was then short? And you've got the people who are simply looking at free trade, arguably less troubled about outcomes, but just seeing that as the optimal way to do it. We've got people who were, at that point, it's called the ruralists, the people who are very concerned about soil and husbandry and so forth, positives, but very much actually really not liking the use of machinery and so on, that skeptical of technology coming through. You've got those coming out of the big manufacturing interests who, well, the thing you have to do is export and die. And looking at industry, technology, and momentum. And then we've got those who wanted to be a member of a larger bloc, which of course at that point was the empire. And of course more recently people have talked about that in terms of the EU. And that's a debate. Those camps, those lines of analysis still really run on. And the question in that, perhaps it helps try and think about what blend we have in trying to look at where we are now. The obvious one where most of this discussion tends to happen is around domestic food supply. How do we supply ourselves? Now, it's not necessarily the most efficient way to run businesses. And we'll pick perhaps up on a different strand of this in a moment, but the capacity to produce, and if we're thinking about crisis, that's really rather important. What would be needed for more self-sufficiency? And an economist pointed out some years ago, if we were really concerned about ensuring supply, actually defence policy might be cheaper. than some of the money that might need to be spent. We will need trade. We'll need trade for inputs, but of course we need to balance. And I give the slightly facetious example here. If Wales didn't trade, it would have to do nothing but eat lamb, which is more or less what goes on in the Falkland Islands, where they call it, I think, 365. There's a limit to doing without trade in all these things. There's a broader need for things. You can take it too far. And there is always a weakness in relying on one source of supply alone. As an American economist says, you should never get more than 25% from any one source. Here are the risks we know: disease, weather, and the rest. So some diversity of supply is part of the mix in all of this. And of course, the business of actually how we did manage matters in World War II. We went to great efforts, but so did much of the empire, and also dealing with it. But it's investment and skill will be needed to produce the more from less that we will actually need as we go through. The value of trade, well, really, we've just talked that one through. So an alternative vision, just to put it on the table. Is our target the 100 million people, richest people in the world? We are a high-cost country, so we have to have high output at good prices. The HDB studies tend to show that we're well regarded in the world for quality, underpinned by regulatory standards. Capitalize on those, aim at that market. It is an alternative for thinking about this. Don't underestimate the sheer, hard, sustained work required to build exports, to break open countries. The things that Minette refers to in passing, that somebody somewhere has said we should get 30% increase in exports by 2030. I don't understand how you would do that. You're looking at this over a 10, 15-year horizon to try and deliver a strategy like this in the way that other countries have seriously applied themselves to it. And a fundamentally important thing in this, the Japanese economy makes a nice analogy. Their export sectors are massively competitive. They have to be. Very efficient. The bits of the Japanese economy that are internal, like retail, people go there and tell me it's like the 1950s. They're completely unexposed to competition. And you see this in the Irish. So the Irish have got a similar growth issue to us in agriculture, but their export end is very competitive. It's just you then go and look at the rest. And the role of being in international trade is the challenge it presents to business is actually very positive for business if you master it. And here is the Dutch counterexample, just to play with this one. Holland, for over a century, has gone down a different road to us. We've tended to think more about domestic supply when we thought about it, or buying food in. Holland has gone for a fundamentally export-based answer, and their agriculture is 1.6% of GDP. So my 1% is sort of modest compared to them. It's they on a tenth of our area, they turn over the same value in income. The world's second largest food exporter. They import almost all their animal food. Yes, there's a bigger brokerage. Historically, for over a century, they've not looked at support. They've gone for business education, business support, classic business support, and education as you go. Clearly, Wageningen is a massive powerhouse in all of this. If you look at where basic payment sits, being members of the CAAV, they get it. It's about 3% of turnover, because their turnover is so large from trade. But everything in Holland, not just agriculture, housing, transport, aviation, is testing environmental limits. I don't think we face particularly a conflict between better businesses, better farming, and environment. Holland is right at the trade-offs for all of this and is feeling the pain with that. So again, all these things help give perspective and help think. We've got the business of the EU reset on the table, and Emma Reynolds talked about it yesterday. We only have a heads of terms, and this looks like one more bright, shiny thing that number 10 has picked up, thought might be a wonderful answer, and is now going to have to discover all the difficulties in it. Fundamentally, what they're talking about means accepting all EU rules as they are and as they then unfold, as we've diverged, different things then over chemicals, different things over gene editing, a whole lot of issues in all of this, and with us having no voice in this process beyond a very early sort of consultation exercise. And into a group which is big, so that's a plus. Easing trade with Northern Ireland, definitely a plus. But actually, is it a growth area? Can we accept the very cautious, highly regulatory instincts of the European Union on all of this? I think they're going to find, I think this is prospectively looking very difficult. The motion in the House the other day, which largely ran on the exercise, look, let's cut the red tape, let's rejoin the EU, would a few years ago have sounded deeply ironic. So I think this is something. Now, whether, as and when Number 10 work out quite how much money, because all this is going on at the same time as the EU is doing its budget negotiations, so having a third country turn up with a pot of money, as we've seen with the youth mobility exercise, is clearly attractive. The defence deal has fallen down on the amount of money Brussels wanted. We just wait to see on all of this. If we are, I think, ready to crack productivity, this is probably not the answer. Always, going back, people look for external and easy single answers. Going back to Shakespeare, the answer lies in ourselves. We have to be better, is really the core of all of this. Other things may then help, but trying to dodge it by doing this. So trying to conclude within the time, choices for farming, looking at all of this, farming land use. Well, of course, we're watching that change in response to climate, in response to markets and so forth as we go through. Now, an easy point is the maize line's gone north over the last generation. The wine industry is the more common example. But we're really looking at the importance in all of this of soils and their relationship with infrastructure. The review of agricultural land classification classes is now 1950s answer, because land depends so much on how well it's drained, with the under-drainage in it, on how it's irrigated, on the supporting infrastructure, and so forth, much more than simply the kind of view we had back when we devised agricultural classification. Permitted development rights are going to be key in this. And of course, we have the whole issues about how we deal with land that is now going to be more vulnerable to flooding. And can we manage higher water tables? Can we manage them actively? Is it worth the investment to do that? The kind of issues flowing through. The mix of outcomes, I think if we were to produce more from less, it has to be with more production under cover. But then the good commodity growers continuing where they are. And then the other balances with adding value, more environmental use of land, and so on as we go through. Soils, I've stressed right the way through, this is a fundamental key issue. In looking at this, getting a baseline for your soil so you know where you start, and then seeking to improve it, and this is a pasture issue as much as an arable issue as we go through. It's difficult to measure. One of the early warnings I had from soil scientists was always go back to the same laboratory. But actually, it's power. It's one of those things that manage, but you can't measure, but accept that and go for the power of better soils. Water, fundamentally, in all of this. Real problem, and this is probably the one environmental goal of the government it is going to cling to in all of this. The issue over water quality, and then our management of shortage of water and excess of water in all of this will become key. Under drainage is a fundamental part of fixed equipment in all this, and was key to the 1980s growth in productivity of arable land. But we have the business of drought. How do we use water? How do we get water, hold it, use it very efficiently? Chemistry. We are losing chemistry, and quite possibly the EU reset will cost us more. If we then have to find other ways of husbandry, the more biological methods of dealing with this, the sheer cost of developing new chemistry, certainly for minor crops, are ruling things out. So thinking about other ways is going to be critical as we tackle this. Yeah, we should go on. We thought we had, yes. A real challenge, I think, to work through, but one there that we should recognise. I think there's an issue, and it's really driven by thinking about inheritance tax. If farming is to be taxed on its capital base, the logical answer is to have less capital. The people who make more than a 10% return on capital, as the Treasury told us 10% of farmers do, are fundamentally tenants who don't have land as capital. They're high-performing in high-output sectors. That is an interesting model for how a business sector would evolve, becoming more separated from a fundamental ownership model of the land. That becomes quite interesting, but the other ways in which you do it, you outsource, contract rearing heifers happened years ago, looking at all of this. Issues of HP and machinery rings and so on, or all a long time. Other ways of looking at your relationship with capital in all of this become possibly quite interesting. But more land, over time, more land taken on tenancies and contracts, initially within families, which is just slicing and dicing the tax liability, but beyond that, probably larger changes. Basically, staff is more expensive, you know that. Staff actually is probably going to be increasingly unavailable. I'm at the point on innovation where you just innovate, you just invest. It's not 3 times the labour saving, you're probably, if you can, if it's feasible, if it works, and if it's efficient, you actually probably look at doing it when you can, rather than waiting for that moment. The Employment Rights Act is sitting in the background. Simple availability of labour, especially in rural areas, is just, is not something to rely on. You automate what can be automated. Innovation. CAAV yesterday morning said this is the biggest moment for innovation, data and evidence since the late 40s. That's probably worth looking at as a thought in all of this. And the things that we all know that people talk about are all there. And so we come to land. And I think the removal of area payments then drives a big element of restructuring as we go through, catching up on a lot of the change that would have happened in the 30 years. We see from our surveys of actual letting agreements, there's much more care and attention to the reasons why people let for different terms and lengths of tenancy and so on than is commonly suggested. But equally as contract farming, the joint ventures and so forth out there, the fundamental point is that we have agreements that give good value to both parties. To be mutual and sustainable over time, these have to be looked at as something that is of value to both parties as we go through. I think the land that will come forward for the let sector is not a matter of estates. It's about small and medium-sized owners who are finding all this too difficult. They've had land, probably their grandfather bought the tenancy. It's come down the line. New generation less interested. They want to own the family land. Great, let it. Have somebody else and produce a better income on this. The market now, there is not a significant market in let farms. It's a market of bare land. And all the issues around housing only make fully equipped, housed land more difficult as we go through this. And we need new lettings to thrive. And actually, my view is that we've got a let sector that's smaller than it would be in a completely free market. So shaping the mutual deal for land and all the various factors there, in a sense the theme that I've stressed, but the right vehicle, record the terms. Fundamentally, think how the agreement is going to end when you draft it at the beginning. Some steps on the way, removing obstacles to letting, thinking about that, and a lot of that's psychological as we go through, but understand the variety of it all. And I do, of course, yet again, note the sheer success of the Irish income tax relief in unlocking a let sector in a country where it was destroyed 120 years ago. That has been very successful to think about it. But looking at tenancies for the future, no illusion. Are we running an economic policy or are we running a social policy? Tenancies are about business. And it is looking at that mutual agreement that does that. And the question then, are we looking at, is a discussion of tenants about protecting current ones or about providing circumstances for future ones? And as with all issues around regulation, that's one of the fundamental choices. But going back to the Treasury's FBS figures, the 10% of farmers who make a 10% return on capital are overwhelmingly wholly tenanted. 45% of tenants in that particular year made more than a 10% return on capital. 42% made a negative return. Completely polarized. A really dramatic, stark distinction in looking at that, and so to think through. And so thinking in all of this, what would success actually look like? So the closing slides on this, about taking positive control, you've heard the themes run through, but iterated towards the end. So government can provide a business-friendly, there we are. Government can provide a business-friendly framework. It can do the planning, it can do the tax, it can do the language, and it can otherwise get out of the way. But it's for farmers, the agency of farmers, to take up the opportunities. And they will be in the situation of each individual farmer. And that, I think, is the key moral. Minette may reshape government. We have to reshape what we do. How do we getting the proficient to make the best use of the land, using the best advice that we can offer from within this room and across the country. And I take the phrase that Jack Bobo started yesterday morning with. It's the stories we tell that are the futures we get. It's how we understand and see the world. And if we look at it as a world that is now opening with opportunities, that has big challenges, but has those opportunities, if we tell those stories to ourselves as well as to others, we'll make a better fist of it all. So thank you. I think questions are at the discretion of people's desire to stay. But happy to take any if anybody has any, or talk afterwards. I'm told that if you confirm on your app that you wish to receive something, I can circulate something in the next few weeks that can include a link to the video of all of this or the slides. That's for you to use the app. It's also for you, I'm told, to unsubscribe if you feel GDPR sensitive. But that's the otherwise we're around.